Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Stern, and today we are going to talk about cellular respiration. You've gotten a little bit of introduction to cellular respiration over the last couple of days, and so today we're really going to dig into this and try to help us understand and separate from each other what's happening to chemical substances and matter in this process, and what's happening to energy in this process, and why this process is so important for living things. So I want to start off with a question. I want you to think about, why do living things need oxygen? A lot of times when I start my year in biology, I'll ask students, like, what defines a living thing? What do living things need? And how do we know if something's alive? And a lot of times this idea comes up that living things need oxygen. So I want you to think about, why do you think that is? And if your answer to that question is, we need oxygen to breathe, I want to push back on that idea, because I think that the cause and effect in that statement is flipped. Like, if you say we need oxygen to breathe, that's not really true, because actually we breathe because we need oxygen. Not all living things that need oxygen actually breathe using lungs. Humans breathe using lungs. Your dog breathes using lungs. Other animals have things that are like lungs. Like insects don't really have lungs, but they have something like a lung. Something like a jellyfish doesn't have lungs. They just get oxygen from diffusion. There's like little tiny oxygen bubbles in the ocean water that will just diffuse from high to low concentration into the cells of the jellyfish. So if breathing is just a way to get oxygen into our bodies, then we don't really have an answer to this question yet. So there is oxygen in the atmosphere, and most of the life that's, out in the world, the plants, the animals actually use oxygen from the atmosphere in their cells. Organisms that live in the ocean will get oxygen from the water. Like the little tiny dissolved oxygen bubbles will diffuse, across the gill tissue of fish or into the bodies of organisms that live in the water. But this still doesn't answer our question, because we need to know, what is oxygen actually for? So to help us understand what oxygen is actually for, I want to talk about combustion. Combustion is a fancy chemistry word for burning stuff. So if you were going to make a campfire, like I did over the past weekend because my daughter was having her third birthday party, you need some fuel for that. Wood from plants is basically made of carbohydrates. Like, you just have these cell walls of the in the tissue, and that has lots of stored energy in it. The plant actually got that energy from the sun and then stored that energy in carbohydrates. And so if you burn fuel, like there's a lot of energy trapped in that wood that when you burn it will come out. To get a fire to burn, if you've ever made a campfire yourself, you know that you're supposed to like arrange the sticks kind of in a teepee shape, because that's going to allow airflow within the fire to get oxygen for combustion. You may have also heard before, like if you have if there's a fire and you're trying to put a fire out, especially like a grease fire, because you don't want to put water on that, you would like smother it with a blanket, and that will, that'll cut off the oxygen that's kind of helping the fire to burn. So combustion needs fuel and it needs oxygen, and then it's exothermic and it releases energy in the form of light and heat. If we look at another example, like combustion in your car, most of our cars, unless you have an electric car, like a truly electric car, there's internal combustion in the car, which means you have gasoline, which is fuel. Gasoline is actually a carbon-based fuel that comes from the bodies of ancient dead plants. So there's actually kind of this connection between wood and gasoline, because fossil fuels are basically like all these bodies of ancient plants, hundreds of millions of year old plants that got trapped under the ground and transformed into coal or oil or gasoline. Gasoline comes from oil. So you have this fuel from dead plants that contains carbon. Your car has like a grill on the front where oxygen, like air intake, can come into the engine, and that's going to bring in oxygen that's needed for combustion. And so the car injects a little bit of fuel into the engine, oxygen comes into the engine, that creates a combustion reaction that will release energy, both to make kinetic energy for the car to move, as well as heat, so that, the engine would get hot. And then carbon dioxide is released in the exhaust. That's that piece of the carbon cycle that, like, the carbon from the gasoline is being transformed into carbon dioxide. The same thing happens with a fire. The carbon from the wood is going to be transformed into carbon dioxide. So the reason that our cells need oxygen is for this kind of combustion. you're going to fuel your cells with food. You're going to need oxygen to help you burn that fuel. It will give off carbon dioxide and water, and it will release energy. That's kind of the big picture of combustion. And I like this picture because it shows us lots of different representations of this. And we're going to use all of these different representations with thinking about it in biology today. A picture is a good place to start. So and the words here. So in this picture, there's a molecule of methane, which is CH4. That's the main fuel component of natural gas. We have oxygen molecules, and oxygen, like the oxygen gas that's in the air or in the little oxygen bubbles in the ocean, that's always found as O2. Oxygen always likes to be paired with another oxygen atom when they're bonded together. So whenever you see O2, what that means is that there's a molecule of two oxygen atoms bonded together. And then here you see that if you combine this methane with carbon dioxide, then you'll get a molecule of carbon dioxide. Notice how the carbon atom in this carbon dioxide came from the methane, from that methane fuel. That's that carbon cycling piece. And then it gives off water as well, because these kinds of carbon-based fuels have hydrogen atoms in them. And so when you combine this fuel with carbon and hydrogen with oxygen, the atoms kind of rearrange and recombine so that hydrogen atoms will bond onto oxygen. So that's where the water comes from. Okay. And then the chemical equation up here shows methane plus oxygen combining together, and then the carbon dioxide and water is given off. These coefficients refer to the numbers of molecules because you have to show that there's equal numbers of atoms starting the equation and ending the equation. So you'll notice like on the left here, there's 4 red circles. And then on the right, there's also 4 red circles because we have the same number of oxygen atoms starting and ending. So that was your quick review of balanced chemical equations so that you understand what's happening today. So if this is how combustion works, fuel plus oxygen react together to release carbon dioxide, water, and energy, cells need to bring in energy in the form of food to make ATP. You learned about this yesterday. We're recharging that ATP battery using food. ATP is like a charged battery. And then when cells use the ATP and like break off that third phosphate, then we think of it as being like a dead battery again. So you obviously do not eat wood or gasoline like a campfire or a car. You eat food. And the main fuel sources that we have for recharging ATP are glucose and fat. We're going to focus mostly on glucose because actually that's the main source of energy that can be directly used to recharge ATP. Fat is made of a lot of the same chemical stuff as glucose is. It's just made of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. And if you don't have a direct source of carbohydrates that you've just consumed, the body can burn through its fat stores. A lot of animals right now, like I'm noticing the squirrels in my yard getting fatter. They're like loading up on carbs from all the nuts that they're eating, as well as like there's a lot of fat in nuts too. But they're storing up fuel in their bodies so that if they aren't able to find food over the winter, they'll have stored fat that they can use as an energy source to recharge their ATP. So you saw this slide as well yesterday, that just remember that cellular respiration is the process that all organisms in the ecosystem, autotrophs, heterotrophs alike, will use to transfer energy from that fuel into ATP. This is why we call the mitochondria the powerhouse of the cell sometimes, because that's sort of the ATP recharging factory in your cells. So find this diagram in your packet. I think it's on page 6. It might be on page 7. Whatever page it's on, find this diagram and we're going to fill this out together just for cellular respiration.